In Ukraine, authorities are warning that Moscow is gearing up for a new push in the Donbas region. But it's not just the east of Ukraine causing concern. Ukraine's border with Belarus is also seeing a troubling military buildup. Western intelligence agencies say that Russian soldiers and weapon systems are ready and waiting in Belarus to open a new front against Ukraine, something that would stretch Kyiv's forces considerably. DW's Nick Connolly went to the border region near Chernihiv to see for himself.
Here, on Ukraine's border with Belarus, you're never really alone.
I'm not sure that drone's one of ours. Actually, it is.
But that's not a given. It was a Russian drone attack from across the border that started the war for these Ukrainian border guards on February the 24th. They tried to keep Russian forces on the Belarus side by blowing up the bridge, but the Russians came all the same and stayed for nearly a month. Since the Russians left in April, the shooting around here has largely been restricted to exercises on both sides of the border. The fear now, among many Ukrainians, is that Russia's exercises in Belarus could suddenly turn into real warfare, just like they did in February. Russian forces have never left Belarus. Instead, their so-called exercises keep getting extended. Ukrainian leaders long said their presence was just a distraction or a bluff rather than a real threat. But recently, Russian troop numbers over the border have risen, and the tone from Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko has grown ever more aggressive. Ukraine's actions are also speaking a different language. These images from the Belarusian government apparently show Ukrainian forces mining their side of the border in recent days. Much of the 1,000-kilometre frontier between Ukraine and Belarus was barely marked, let alone defended, before this war. Back then, trips across the border for groceries or to see a doctor were part of everyday life.
We used to go to Belarus, and they would come to us. We all just got on somehow. I didn't even think a war like this was even possible. Who knows what's next?
The war has taken its toll on many family ties that span this border.
Many people here in the village have relatives on the Belarusian side. Some of them have stopped talking to each other because of the war. I believe Ukraine will win eventually. It has to. We can't afford to lose.
Many locals here have given up their jobs to try to make sure that holds true.
We have a security guard, a driver, shop assistants, and locksmiths.
Konstantin's life changed overnight. He was called up, put in charge of dozens of men in the Territorial Defence Force. His experience? Some brief military training at university. He'd never actually fought.
People in other places can't know what it feels like when bombs are falling and your child is terrified of everything. Most of us here have never even been in a fight until the war. And then when it starts, you know, if the enemy comes, you do what you need to do without thinking twice.
The atmosphere here might seem relaxed and domestic, with neighbours and even fathers and sons serving side by side. But the real sense of threat is never far away. Konstantin tells us he's never yet had to call a family with news of a fatality. He doesn't sound sure it'll stay that way.
And I'm joined now by Katya Glod from the Center for European Policy Analysis. She's an expert on Belarus and Russia. Thank you so much for joining us. As we know and as we've heard, Belarus has long served as a staging ground for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But are the people in that report now right to fear that Belarus could become the latest front in the Russian offensive?
Good morning, Sarah. I think there are certainly signs that there has been an increase in military activity along the border with Ukraine and Belarus. We know that there have been certain Russian equipment brought back to Belarus, particularly around two airports not far from the border with Ukraine. We have also seen some preparation for mobilization-like efforts. We heard, for example, that in one area in the south, men were asked to show up for a potential military draft. And obviously, Lukashenko also said several days ago that Belarus will always support Russia. But on the other hand, even Lukashenko's rhetoric has been a bit ambiguous, because he was also trying to say that this is not our war that we are fighting. So I think at the moment, we don't really know whether these are the signs for Lukashenko to show his loyalty to Putin and to show preparedness to fight, but actually avoid doing so, or whether it is indeed a very gradual engagement of Belarus into the war. We know that the Kremlin has been quite active in other spheres to drag Belarus slowly in the processes which is interested in. But at the same time, the fundamentals remain the same. Belarusian army is very small, it's poorly trained, it has no combat experience. So most military experts think that even if Belarus participates, it would be to a very marginal degree, more like in some subversion, intelligence efforts, or likely to, again, protect the Russian army in the rear rather than participating in a full-scale invasion.
How about the people within Belarus? How do they view the war in Ukraine? Do we even know? And are they worried about getting further dragged deeper into the conflict?
Yes, there are some independent polls which are now mostly conducted through the internet. So they really cover people who only have access to the internet. But by all the statistics available, it's over 80% of the Belarusian population. And the picture there inside Belarus is actually quite different from what we see within the Russian public. For example, a few days ago, 2 polls came out which confirmed the trends that over 85% of Belarusians are against the Belarusian armed forces being deployed to Ukraine. And that has not really changed since the beginning of the war. And this is probably also what prevents Lukashenko from agreeing to give the Belarusian army to Putin, because that would be devastating for him politically. And people even within the regime of Alexander Lukashenko himself are very likely to think the same what the Belarusian public think, that this is not the Belarusian war, and it is really a shame that Belarus is part of that.
Thank you so much, Katya Glad. As we mentioned, you're joining us from the Center for European Policy and Analysis. Thank you for sharing your expertise.